Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Muddy York. We've got a really good one today. So, here's the thing. The Don Valley is one of those places in Toronto we think we know. It's that blur out the window where traffic slows to a crawl at rush hour. It's the punchline in every joke about failed city planning and floods that come for your basement. But underneath all of that, literally and figuratively, is one of the oldest and strangest stories Toronto has to offer. It's a river valley shaped by glaciers, ignored by colonial city builders, haunted by environmental missteps, and reclaimed again and again by people who saw something worth saving. It's where we dumped our problems, buried our guilt, and then tried to pave over it all with expressways and metaphors. So today, we're going to slow down and actually listen to the Don Valley. We've got an incredible guest, Jennifer Bonnell, an environmental historian, educator, and someone who spent more time thinking about Toronto's rivers than most of us spend thinking about our extended families. She's here to help us make sense of the Don, its past, its future, and its many identities. Marsh dump, battleground, refuge, and surprisingly, home. This is Muddy York, and today, Adam and I are going to dive deep into the valley, not just geographically, but geologically, emotionally, existentially. Let's get into it. Jennifer, thank you so much for being with us today. This is great for having you. Great, thanks.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, we're talking about the Don Valley and everything that encompasses. First of all, can you just tell the listeners a little bit about you so we get to know you a little bit better?
Sure. I'm an environmental historian. I teach history, Canadian history, environmental history at York in the Department of History there. But I'm not a Torontonian, considering that this is a Toronto history podcast. I actually grew up on Vancouver Island on the West Coast. And so I'm a transplant. I've been here in the city for, I guess, like 25 years, something like that, a long time. And I think because I come from a place of bigger, wilder rivers, I was fascinated by the Don when I first moved to Toronto because it seemed like such a neglected space, especially the lower Don. But I was pretty amazed by the number of Torontonians who wanted to spend their weekends hauling shopping carts and tires out of the river and fighting for a different vision for this neglected urban river in city council chambers and elsewhere. So it was that kind of citizen activism and interest in what was a place that looked anything like anything but a river. To me, when I first moved here, that really got me interested in this project.
So the Don Valley is one of the landmarks of Toronto, but how did it get that way? How is it that we have a grand river valley running right through the middle of what's now Toronto?
Well, I think, first of all, I'd say it didn't always run right through Toronto. It was certainly a river at the eastern edge of the old city. But in terms of how we get this big, wide river valley, running through the city as it does, I think we have to look back some, 12,000 years to the retreat of those last glaciers. And actually the east and the west Don, as those glaciers were retreating 12,000 years ago, they kind of flowed out of what we now understand as the Oak Ridges Moraine, which was this glacial deposit north of the city. And you had all of this glacial melt running down towards what is now Lake Ontario, away from those glaciers and carving out these big valley spaces as the meltwater ran south. So it's not the tiny Don that carved this wide river valley, but that much wider glacier melt of many years ago. And it's actually, I'll be as quick as I can, it's a longer process in that the Don once flowed into a much larger prehistoric lake known as Lake Iroquois. And when, with changing land after glaciation, Lake Iroquois eventually drains as the land rebounds, and we get a much smaller version of it that is now Lake Ontario. So you can still kind of see the boundaries of that ancient Lake Iroquois. The shoreline is, along the line of Davenport Road in Toronto. You can see that jump in topography, which was the ancient shoreline of Lake Iroquois, rather. And so the Don kind of ends up joining together those two, the East and West Don and Taylor Creek, kind of meet at that ancient Lake Iroquois shoreline and come together to form the Lower Don and run into the smaller Lake Ontario about 9,000 years ago. So that's the geological history. I'm sure it's much more complicated than that, but that gives you a quick rundown of how we get this, pretty small river running through a really wide, dramatic river valley.
So Toronto was founded in 1793, but that wasn't the first people there. What kind of people were living or working in the Don Valley before the British arrived?
Yeah, certainly. So, when we think about the big river valleys in the region, we think about the Rouge and we think about the Humber. And the Don is sort of a little blip of a river in between, really. So when we think about the Indigenous history of the region and settlements in the area, certainly the Don was a place for fishing, for hunting, but it wasn't a place of village sites, at least in the most recent history. Archaeologists will tell you that they've found, really wonderful discoveries further north in the watershed of indigenous peoples that lived in the valley, after the retreat of the glaciers thousands of years ago. So they've found, evidence of those communities around Withrow Park and then further north. But in the historic period, at least the period that we have things written down for, we know that, for example, the Seneca had, which were an Iroquoian group, they had village sites on the Humber and on the Rouge. And the Don was sort of used as an alternate route to the Toronto carrying place. So that route that went up the Humber to the Upper Lakes, the Don was another way of getting there. So it was more difficult to travel, lots of, smaller river, trees down, harder to pass in a canoe. So it wasn't the chosen route, but it eventually becomes significant in that it becomes the route that becomes Yonge Street, a good chunk of the valley, becomes an important corridor later on.
So what happened when the British arrived?
Yeah, and so I just wanted to add to that last piece in terms of one of the most important features of the Don is the massive marsh at its mouth. So Ashbridges Bay Marsh, which later becomes the Portlands. This was one of the largest marshes on Lake Ontario. And so this would have been a very significant feature for Indigenous peoples using the valley, in that it was a great place to hunt waterfowl. It was just teeming with both aquatic life and birds and mammals. So people would have come there to fish, to gather foods, and certainly were still doing so when the Europeans arrived in at least the latest iteration of the Europeans arrived in the 1790s. So essentially, the region had been used by fur traders and certainly French traders before then, but it's not until the 1790s that the Lieutenant Governor, John Grave Simcoe, comes to the Toronto area from Newark, which is we now know as Niagara-on-the-Lake, kind of seeking out another possible capital for Upper Canada that would be a bit further away from the American border. And what Simcoe finds when he comes here, and it's a pretty hasty assessment, right? He's just having a quick look around, and he sees that, there's this nice protected harbor, Toronto's East Harbor, protected by that sort of scooping sandbar that becomes the Toronto Islands. And so he decides this is a good place for the future capital of Upper Canada. And in 1793, he establishes the town of York quite near the mouth of the Don. So really in the eastern end of the harbor at the foot of Parliament Street. And, he looks to the Don as something that will provide for this new city that needs to be developed. He sees stands of white pine upriver. Okay, that's great for, building houses. And he notices that the river valley has a lot of clay deposits that will be great for brickyards and other things. So he sees protection for ships in the harbor and construction materials in the valley. So, the valley really features prominently in his visions for the future settlement.
So the Don Valley contributes to some significant environmental issues in the city, one notably dubbed the Don problem. So do you think you could tell us about that?
Yeah, okay. Well, if you'll permit me, I'll go a bit further back in that the Don problem actually starts a lot earlier. It starts a lot earlier than the industrialization. And this is because early settlers to the east end of the city, people who were settling around Ashbridges Bay Marsh and in the East End, the Ashbridges family being one of them, noticed that the east end of the city is especially prone to something they call lake fever or ague. It's sort of, alternating fevers and chills that almost everybody who, lived in the area in the 1790s and in the early 1800s experienced every summer. And we now know this to be a version of malaria. Is essentially lake fever ague is the same as malaria. And because there had been so much deforestation and so much change in the land in this period, the mosquitoes that carried malaria actually extended their range north into the area around Toronto. And so it's interesting that the East End was especially prone to malaria. And I think we can see that in our, real estate prices even today. The East was always less desirable. And because of that lack of desirability, you see the city sort of moving its foundations north and west. The Parliament buildings move from the foot of Parliament, downtown to Front and John, and desirable real estate moves with it. And as a result, the Don becomes something of a sort of edge space. It becomes a place to tip everything you don't want to look at and things that you don't want to smell. And so as early as the 1850s, you get, slaughterhouses and tanneries and less desirable industry locating along the lower Don. And then this idea of the Don problem that you referenced, it dates back to that early problem about disease and undesirability. But you get, even for this tiny river, it still managed to kill people every year because it would flood. Not everyone could swim. And bridges would often be, some of these early bridges that weren't very strong would be wiped out every year, every spring, and every fall with big rainfall and ice melt. So you'd get people dying in the Don. So that was one of the problems. With flooding, you'd get the pollution from these early industries running down and into the harbor, including, dead horses and everything. And you'd also get all of that silt and, logs and debris moving downriver and really irritating people who were trying to boat in the inner harbor, like boats coming in to bring freight and coal and other things. They were always they had real navigation hazards because of all of the silt and debris that came down the Don, because of all the development that was happening up further north in the watershed. Deforestation brings debris. So the Don problem was one of silt, one of pollution, and one of flooding. And of course, it's blamed on the river. All of these developments that are coming. And so the Don becomes kind of a place to industrialize because it's problematic, because it's already problematic. Let's make use of this problematic kind of deviant space at the city's edges and make it more profitable for industry.
I'm always interested in what it was actually like. Have you ever come across any first-hand accounts of the smell, or when you mentioned the horses in the river, anything like that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's great stuff in the newspapers of the 1880s, especially around this big scheme to straighten the Don, right? And they're trying to get all these politicians and residents on board to vote for this. And so, there's all these grand plans being discussed. We're going to straighten the river. We're going to flush all these pollutants into the lake. We're going to make ice jams, which cause flooding. We're going to make those things a thing of the past. So there's all these big grand statements, right? Well, then you get, after the straightening happens in the late 1880s and it's finished in like 1891, you get all these, wonderful accounts in the local Toronto papers saying the Don is like, it's like a slimy soup-like consistency. They describe how horrible it smells, how yellow and green it looks. And they're really getting at the fact that all of the expense that went into these changes really did nothing to stop the problem of pollution in the Don, partly because, they run into problems running the river straight into the lake because that would run right into British American Oil's property, an oil refinery right at the mouth of the Don. And so they end up with a right-hand turn, which we still know as Keating Channel, right? And, they first end up with a bend, and then they build Keating Channel as one of the strategies to remove some of that pollution in the marsh. And so, because some of these big plans fail, you get rather gleeful reports by Toronto reporters, just talking about the level of failure and the ongoing problems with flooding that continued.
So you mentioned the project to straighten the Don, which was also a plan to deepen it. They called it the Don Improvement Project.
Yeah.
And what was the idea behind this? Why is a straighter, deeper river considered better?
Well, they originally had the idea that they would bring boating traffic all the way north to Bloor Street, to Bloor Danforth. So that was one idea, is we wanted to have a channel that could take boat traffic, because the Don, before they straightened it, was very, very curvy, lots of oxbows and even islands in the river. And its depth really varied year to year, especially when you had all this pollution coming into the river, and silt deposits really changing its depth. So that was one of the visions. And like I said, the other was if you deepen it and straighten it, all of that pollution can just be pushed right into the lake. So there was big ideas around that. And also that would deal with ice jams that created flooding. At least that was the idea. But, a lot of the politicians who were promoting this plan, a number of them actually held property along the lower Don and stood to benefit through the, brilliance, the magic of creating free land, right? Like when you fill water with land, you create presto, new real estate. And so, there were fortunes to be gained by this, but it's really not until Canadian Pacific Rail gets involved that this project actually, gets started. In that, at that point, Canadian Pacific Rail is moving their trains all the way across the city to the western end and then backing them into the city. So they really wanted an eastern entrance to the city so that they could come south and then carry on and move out the west end. And so, it's difficult to run a rail line along a curvy river. So they saw the straightening of the Don as a way to run their lines south through the valley, which created a kind of friction-free corridor for rail, right? As it later does for highways. And so they could run their rail line down south. The Don, presented a very attractive route for that rail development. And they become the big stakeholder that pushes this project forward.
So exactly how big of a success was it? I mean, was it a complete success? Was it a smashing success? Did everything go right or just 99%?
Well, certainly we see some further industrialization along, the lower Don, which was one of certainly a large objective of the project. You get William Davies pork packing plant where Corktown Common now is. That certainly expands. You get the expansion of refineries, oil refineries and gas plants and so on, further south along the Don. So industrialization happens. But when you look at images from the 1920s in the City of Toronto archive, so 20, 30 years after the straightening, there's tons of images of flooding in that area, of ongoing ice jams that meant that, people had to come down and try to, use hammers and try to get rid of all that ice to allow the river to flow, because it would mount, the ice would come as high as the rail line running through there, which was a real problem. And then, of course, the pollution is not at all abated by this project. And the silt, to this day, the Port Authority has to dredge silt that accumulates in that bend in the mouth of the Don. So no, the project is a series of half measures at best. They're not able to get the depth that they were looking for because they end up hitting shale in the on the riverbed. It was much harder to penetrate than they thought. The project was a lot more expensive than they thought. And do we get boats moving up to Bloor Street? No, that doesn't happen. So it's successful for rail in straightening the river. It's successful for industry, but we still get these ongoing problems.
That's so interesting. And you mentioned Ashbridges Bay, and I want to talk about filling in Ashbridges Bay. To me, sounds like an environmental game of Tetris. So why did they do this? Was it for progress, or did we just fill in something that we shouldn't have filled in?
Well, by that point, by the time that the city takes the measures to begin to reclaim, as they call it, or fill Ashbridges Bay Marsh in the 1910s, Ashbridges Bay Marsh by that point is a horribly polluted space. So, there's some wonderful histories of what the marsh once looked like. There was a fishing village, Fisherman's Island once. We have a remnant of it in Cherry Beach today. So the marsh and its aquatic life and wildlife once supported these communities of settlers mostly, and before that of Indigenous peoples who would come there seasonally to hunt and fish. But as the Don industries accumulated in the Don, and it's not just industries, it's sewage. So Rosedale is the first to, take sewage pipes down to the Don in the 1870s, I believe, 1870s, 1880s. So you've got raw sewage coming into this tiny river. And then you've got big industries on the waterfront, like Gooderman Worts, who are the whiskey distillers in the distillery district today. But at the time, they were sitting right at the eastern edge of the harbor, near Ashbridges Bay Marsh and the mouth of the Don. And the problem with a company like Gooderman Worts wasn't so much the whiskey production, but the fact that they were piping the spent mash from their whiskey underneath the river to the east side of the river, where they had all of these cattle and pig barns, like thousands and thousands and thousands of cattle and pigs. And all of the manure from those pigs and cattle went directly into the marsh. So the conditions got so terribly polluted by these organic pollutants, not to mention all the rest of the stuff going in there from all the industry, that you had the Provincial Board of Health and the City Board of Health getting involved in the 1890s. And, Torontonians were really concerned because cholera was moving closer and closer to the city from other areas. And there was real legitimate concern about a cholera outbreak in the 1890s. And as a result, there's lawsuits. Gooderman Worts is threatened with lawsuits unless they clean up their act. They start to filter some of that sewage. And really what everyone agrees, the only solution is to fill the marsh. So it's not to stop the pollution, really, because, there weren't really good measures at the time to deal with that, although some of it could have been dealt with on land, I guess. But in any case, everyone agreed what we need to do is fill the marsh, and won't that be a bonus in that we can create a whole new industrial area, which, people at the time in the late 19th and early 20th century really believed was the best use for a very problematic landscape.
Yes. And speaking about, problematic issues, the Don Valley has always been has been a refuge for those without home. Is this a case of the landscape offering shelter, or what made the Don Valley so, I don't want to use the word appealing, but useful, I guess, for the unhoused community?
Yeah. I think it's always been a difficult landscape, right? Sorry if I've interrupted. It's always been a kind of difficult landscape, and that's partly the reason why we still have the valley today as a mostly green space, mostly parkland for the city, in that it was tough to develop, right? All the tablelands get developed, but these awkward, challenging ravine spaces are mostly left, they got logged in certain areas, but they're mostly left undeveloped. And as a result, they become places that are difficult to police, difficult to surveil in any effective way. And so they end up serving as refuges for people who were at the edges of society. So, just like it becomes a place to tip undesirable substances, it also becomes a place that harbors undesirable human populations by, the standards of, mainstream Torontonians. So, not only is it a place where people have lived rough for a very long time, it's also a place where the city quite deliberately located institutions that other people really didn't want to be that close to. So whether that was the Toronto, the Don Jail, or the House of Refuge, so places where, various isolation hospitals were also located in the Don, including one that is now Bridgepoint Health and was once the Riverdale Isolation Hospital, I believe it was called. So places where you put people who had infectious diseases, where you put people who were poor and couldn't, were thought not to be able to contribute to society. And also places where, in World War II, there were prisoner of war camps in the valley at Todmorden Mills. So, there's that long history. And I think for places like the Don Jail, the valley, further, this is a bit further north near Riverdale Park in the lower valley, it's still a bit pastoral, and it was considered a good place to situate a jail because you could have a jail farm there. So it was kind of considered bizarrely a sort of restorative landscape for people, for prisoners. But I think when you think of the history of homelessness, I found records in the newspapers dating back to the very early 1800s. So, almost as long as the city has been the city of York, and later Toronto, we had instances of homelessness, I think, because people weren't bothered there. They weren't likely to get bothered by the police and asked to move on. They could also subsist to a certain degree. So they could access water in the river. There were stories in the 1910s and 20s of Roma families who were living in the valley and harvesting grasses in the river valley and selling baskets at St. Lawrence Market. So, the valley provided in certain ways to these groups as well.
Do you have any idea, or are there any records of what happened to the Roma who were living there?
They sort of disappear from the records, and the only reason they appear in the newspaper in the first place is because Torontonians were upset that they were there. So you get this sort of outrage that we have, what were once known as gypsies. Now we typically understand as Roma people living in the valley. The valley ran through all these residential neighborhoods, so people were sort of affronted that you had people sort of living wild or accessing water and building fires in the valley close to them. So it's outrage that places them in the newspapers in the first place. And of course, that outrage isn't necessarily sustained. So we don't necessarily, I sort of lose their path and what happens to them. And I think that they were sort of living there seasonally anyway, as transient peoples, kind of being there some seasons and not in others. One of the biggest instances of the valley harboring people who were homeless was during the Depression in 1930 and 31, when the Don Valley Brickworks actually becomes a place where unemployed men who were traveling into the city by train could take refuge. So the manager of the brickworks offers them a place to sleep on the cooling bricks within the brick factory. And so they could stay warm on cold winter nights. And many of them had sort of tents and shanties in the river valley near the brickworks.
And just for listeners at home, That is the Don Valley Brickworks is the brickworks that's in the Don Valley, where they now host a whole bunch of educational programs and have the farmers markets.
Evergreen Brickworks. Yeah. Yeah.
So after World War II, there was a campaign to change how the city approached the Don Valley. Can you talk a bit about the birth of the conservationist movement there?
Yeah. So, someone like Charles Sorial, who I feature in the book, and some older residents of Toronto may remember Sorial. He died in 94, but he was probably the Don's biggest champion and biggest conservationist. And he's a really interesting character in that he actually had a cottage in the valley. Beginning in the 1920s, he started buying up land from the rail companies and for very cheap, and reforesting, areas that had been pretty heavily deforested. So if you think of Toronto in the early 20th century as fairly denuded, Sorial was one of the people who wanted to change that. He ends up constructing a cottage near the forks of the Don, but his year-round home is near Broadview and Mortimer. So he's moving his family every summer just a few kilometers upriver to what became quite a lovely property with an orchard, and he kept bees and so on, a place to sort of live in the valley. And he hiked all through the valley. He knew many other cottagers. And through them, by the 1940s, he found something called the Don Valley Conservation Association. Not the same as the Don Valley Conservation Authority, which is, a precursor of the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. This was a more grassroots group that Sorial founded, and he really wanted to raise awareness of the valley as a place that deserved protection, because they were starting to build a lot of apartment buildings really close to the valley, and people were dumping all sorts of garbage into the valley. And, he wanted Torontonians to respect and learn to love this place as he did. So Sorial is sort of the first conservationist. And he had a group of people that were very active in, writing about the valley and doing a monthly or several newsletters a year and so on. But it's really Hurricane Hazel in 1954 that really changes perceptions of Toronto's ravines all across the city. So, there aren't any deaths in the Don Valley as there were in the Humber River Valley, but it was the experience of these massive amounts of floodwaters that came down in such, rapid succession that's, caused Torontonians to recognize that these were vital drainage spaces for floodwaters. And so we needed to make sure that we weren't building in the valleys anymore, but protecting them as drainage corridors and as parkland for Torontonians to enjoy. So, city planners and the Toronto Conservation Authority had before then, as early as the 1940s, recognized the valleys as just really significant corridors for drainage. But it's Hurricane Hazel that brings the public awareness of that.
It's so interesting because as I listen to you speak, the Don Valley, it touches almost every single podcast episode that we've done this year, and I'm just realizing it because you just mentioned topic after topic that we've already covered. So it's very fascinating to me. But moving on to another thing that we've covered a little bit, but we need to know about. So the construction of the Don Valley Parkway that represented a significant infrastructure development. So how do you think that this project balanced? What I guess I'm trying to ask, how did it balance the demands of modern transportation with they tried to preserve the Don Valley at the same time, right?
Yeah. Yes. So I think the construction of the Don Valley Parkway is such an interesting moment, and there's a chapter on it in my book, in that it brings together these, long-standing historical tensions. So this idea of the Don Valley as a somehow undesirable, deviant space factors into thinking about it as, the natural place for a highway, right? And then you've got the budding conservation movement of the 1940s, which is trying to get Torontonians to think about this as a place we want to cherish and protect. So you get the leader of the conservation movement at the time, Charles Sorial, with that sort of place-based, we got to protect this place idea coming up against Frederick Gardner, who's the chair of the Metro Toronto, the Metropolitan Council of Toronto, who's got a vision. Frederick Gardner had a vision for big highways all across the Toronto region, only two of which are actually built, which is the Gardner Expressway and the Don Valley Parkway. And so for Gardner,
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I feel like I should offer Frederick Gardner's position on this, and I'm going to do my best attempt at an Irish brogue, and it's going to be awful. I'll tell you what the Don Valley was. The Don Valley was a place to murder little boys. That's what it was. That was an official quote from Frederick Gardner in the discussion of the Don Valley Parkway. I hope everyone appreciates my linguistic efforts.
yes, thank you. And I use that quote in my book because that really epitomizes the way Gardner saw the valley as essentially a deviant place, a place there'd been a history of gang activity in the valley. There'd been murders in the valley. So it fed into that public idea of the valley as a kind of underworld that needed to be tamed. And for Gardner, what better way to tame the valley than to run a highway through it? And so, of course, the valley itself provides a sort of natural environment that doesn't, what I describe as a friction-free environment. There aren't a lot of houses to deal with. There's not a lot of opposition. In fact, there's really only public support with the exception of Sorial and a few others, for moving this highway through. So it actually gets built quite quickly in the early 1960s. And one of the off-ramps, the O'Connor off-ramp, I think, runs right through Sorial's cottage. So Sorial is expropriated as a result of the Don Valley Parkway construction. He moves to the other side. He has property on the other side of the river. He moves his family to the other side of the river. And ironically, he's expropriated a second time 10 years later when the Toronto Region Conservation Authority decides it doesn't want, in the aftermath of Hurricane Hazel, doesn't want any more structures in the valley. And so an organization that he's now involved in, he's part of the foundation for the Conservation Authority, ends up expropriating him from his second holding in the valley. And so the story of the Parkway is certainly one of personal tragedy for Sorial. But I think most Torontonians today celebrate it in that, they sort of plow through the valley and then reconstruct the landscape around it as sort of a more civilized parkland that then City Parks takes over and manages.
So jumping ahead a bit, for the last 10 years or so, the city's had a very large Lower Don project. People may have heard, pieces of it or discussions from the news, but can you just let our listeners know what the city's doing about the Don right now?
Yeah, it's sort of absolutely fantastic. I mean, what's been happening for the last 5 years at the mouth of the Don is, I think Toronto's best kept secret. And I know Waterfront Toronto's been doing quite more and more efforts to get the word out because this wonderful parkland they've created should be opening to the public in the fall of 2025. So keep your eyes on the news. But essentially, taking this longer history and these concerns about flooding, these concerns about silt and other things coming down the Don, and this history of industrialization, which created incredibly contaminated soils in the Portlands, meant that in order to turn what was a really essentially industrial brownfield, because industry starts moving out of the Portlands, really from the 30s to the 50s, you start to see a decline. And it's basically been a place to go, pick up some aggregate rock or go-karting since the 80s. So it's been a very underutilized space with wonderful views of the city center. So there's been the desire to develop it for a long time, but they were really unable to do so until they dealt with the soil contamination. And when I mean soil contamination, I mean 7 meters deep of oil running through the soils there due to all the oil refineries and coal storage and other kinds of energy uses of the Portlands in the latter half of the 20th century. So a ton of contamination and then a big flood risk because essentially the Portlands is in the floodplain of the Don. So if we have another Hurricane Hazel or a flood of that size, anything built there would be really underwater. So Waterfront Toronto brought together funding from 3 levels of government to really tackle these problems. And much of the project is really a flood protection. It's at its core, a flood protection project. But what they have done is rerouted the mouth of the Don along its historic course further south into the harbor. And that was just a massive engineering undertaking. Decontaminated 7 meters of soil through much of this area. And so they've created a lot of really quite wonderful wetlands. When you visit the site, it looks like this natural wetland area, but it's actually heavily constructed all the way down. It's an armored landscape to protect for flood. And essentially they're building the basis for a future residential community that will have both, I believe, some below market price housing and some, standard condos. But what you'll see in the fall is the first phase of that, which is opening up the parklands. And they've created wetlands. They've created just wonderful water spaces where people will be able to canoe and kayak, as well as, playgrounds and other kinds of parkland. So it is really a big project for Toronto. It's not the kinds of projects we do very often, and people should go and visit it. The bridges down there are absolutely stunning, and we're barged down the St. Lawrence from Halifax. So there's just wonderful things to see, and there's been some good writing about the project.
Just the last question we were going to ask is about how would you describe the current conditions in the Don or the Don Valley?
Yeah, if you're thinking like things like water quality, it's a bit of a mixed bag. We've had a lot of improvement in things like phosphorus levels, which have improved across the Great Lakes through, regulations on laundry soap and thinking about agriculture differently. Starting to see a decline in phosphorus, which is a pollutant, causes algae blooms. But we've seen a spike in road salt, and road salt makes rivers very hard to live in. So salt levels are terrible for aquatic life. They also mean the river won't freeze like it did in the 19th century because the salt raises the temperature. And this is mostly runoff from roads. The amount of salt that we put on our roads and put on places like the Don Valley Parkway, it always ends up in our waterways. And we haven't seen a lot of change in the amount of salt that's being put on our roads in the wintertime. So water quality is a real mixed bag, but with some of the changes at the mouth of the Don and this, they put in also some aquatic habitat as part of this big project. And they're already seeing at the mouth of the Don and in the inner harbor, the return of many aquatic species, both in terms of diversity and abundance. So we're seeing more aquatic species, and we're even seeing some, threatened species like the American eel returning to the area around the mouth of the Don. So I think there's hope. The valley is still, there's also been we've improved through the conservation authorities, done a ton of work to try to bring up the forest cover in the valley. So we've seen, I think, a slight increase in forest cover through that work. It's still a highly urbanized, mostly paved over valley, right? When we think about the absence of porous surfaces in the valley, which mean water runs through it fast and hot and has implications for the river. But we've seen some good improvement and certainly more people out enjoying those spaces since the pandemic, and the work on the Lower Don Recreational Trail and things like that are bringing people into the valley, which is good.
That's great. So before we leave everybody today, do you have either a heartwarming or wonderful story about the Don Valley or something incredibly bizarre and weird about the Don Valley that you could potentially share with us as a final parting note?
Okay, well, I think the book opens with this little anecdote about sort of like a game of telephone. Princess Margaret comes to visit the valley, and I'm forgetting the decade. I'll have to look this up. I think it's the 50s.
I believe it was 1958.
very much, Adam. So Princess Margaret is making a visit to Toronto, and she's going to be sleeping in her rail car in the Lower Don around Riverdale Park. And because in the 50s, the Don was an especially stinky place, there's a great flurry of activity. What are we going to do to clean up this, problematic waterway? And people remember this differently, and that's part of why I found this so fascinating. Is people remember, oh, it was the Queen. She came, and they poured perfume into the river. Oh no, they poured flowers into the river. Oh no, I heard that. So there was all this stuff, and I finally tracked it through the newspaper records and found that no, they didn't pour flowers into the river, nor did they pour perfume into the river, nor was it the Queen. It was Princess Margaret. And what they did was they dumped a lot of lye onto the riverbanks to try to mask the smell of the river not to offend the princess's sensibilities during her visit in 1958. But it's both the visit, the response by the city, and the long game of telephone that happens between Torontonians in the decades that follow that I found really, really kind of wonderful as an opening story for thinking about how Torontonians' experience with this river over, a couple centuries.
Oh, that's a great.
Jennifer mentioned her book. It is Reclaiming the Don. The second edition came out last year. You can get it in stores, or if you're cheap like me, you can get it at the library.
Great. Okay, Jennifer, thank you so much for coming on the show. What insight you gave us. I feel like we could dive so much deeper into a million different topics you brought up today. But thank you so much for being on. Guys, thank you for tuning in, listening to the Muddy York podcast. As always, I'm Grayson Miller.
And I'm Adam Weiser.
See you soon.